Salem, Massachusetts, 1692. Margaret Scott, a 77-year-old woman, stands trembling in the town square. Her crime? A neighbor claimed she made their cow sick by looking at it wrong. What happens next will make your blood run cold, because Margaret is about to become victim number 19 in a campaign of terror that has nothing to do with supernatural evil and everything to do with raw human power. But here is what nobody tells you about witch trials. They were not hysterical responses to supernatural threats. They were calculated programs of social engineering, designed by brilliant minds and religious authorities who understood exactly how fear could be weaponized to control entire populations. Think witch hunting was primitive medieval superstition? Think again. The torture techniques I am about to reveal were developed during the Renaissance by some of the most educated people in Europe. University-trained lawyers, ordained priests, and government officials spent decades perfecting methods of human destruction that were so sophisticated, so psychologically devastating, that they make modern interrogation techniques look like playground games. Between 1500 and 1700, European authorities published detailed torture manuals with the same scientific precision we use for medical textbooks today. Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger's Malleus Maleficarum was not just a guide for identifying witches. It was a comprehensive handbook for human destruction that influenced legal frameworks across 3 continents. But wait until you hear the numbers that will completely change how you understand this period. Conservative estimates put witch trial deaths at 60,000. But here is what will shock you. For every person executed, at least 10 more were tortured, imprisoned, had their property confiscated, or were driven from their communities. We are talking about persecution that destroyed the lives of over 500,000 people across Europe and America. And here is the part that will make you question everything you thought you knew about history. The peak of witch hunting coincided exactly with the Renaissance and early Enlightenment. While Galileo was revolutionizing astronomy and Shakespeare was writing masterpieces, scholars were perfecting techniques for destroying human beings with scientific precision. The Spanish Inquisition alone investigated 150,000 cases over 3 centuries, executing 32,000 people while torturing hundreds of thousands more. In Germany, Prince Bishop Julius Ector executed 900 people in Würzburg while confiscating property worth over 2 million ducats, enough to build 3 cathedrals. Matthew Hopkins, England's self-proclaimed witchfinder general, had over 300 people executed in just 2 years while earning the equivalent of a nobleman's annual income. These were not random acts of violence. They were coordinated business enterprises that combined religious authority with legal procedure and economic incentive to create self-perpetuating machines of terror. The torture methods were standardized, the legal frameworks were coordinated internationally, and the profits were enormous. Today we are exposing 8 torture methods that reveal the true purpose of witch trials, creating a machine of terror so efficient that entire populations would police themselves rather than risk being fed into its gears. These techniques were so effective at social control that authoritarian regimes studied and copied them well into the 20th century. Hit that like button if you are ready to discover how educated authorities used scientific torture to maintain absolute control, and comment below what you thought witch trials were actually about, because this video will shatter every assumption you have ever held about the relationship between education and cruelty. You need to understand something that will fundamentally change how you view this period of history. Witch hunting was not carried out by ignorant peasants driven by superstition. It was designed and implemented by the intellectual elite of European society who applied Renaissance thinking to the problem of social control with the same methodical approach used for architectural engineering or mathematical calculation. The timing is crucial and reveals the calculated nature of these campaigns. Witch hunting peaked during the same period that produced Shakespeare, Galileo, and Leonardo da Vinci. While Michelangelo painted the Sistine Chapel ceiling, inquisitors were perfecting the strapado. While Copernicus revolutionized astronomy, scholars were designing torture chambers with the same precision used for astronomical instruments. Johannes Nider, a Dominican theologian with a doctorate from the University of Vienna, wrote Formicarius in 1437, one of the first comprehensive guides to witch identification and persecution. This was not the work of an uneducated fanatic, but a respected scholar who applied scholastic reasoning and university-trained logical analysis to justify torture with the same intellectual rigor used for theological debates. Think about the bureaucratic precision involved in these operations. Witch hunting required detailed legal frameworks that could justify extreme violence while maintaining the appearance of legitimate justice. Standardized procedures had to be developed that could be replicated across different jurisdictions. Specialized equipment needed to be designed and manufactured. Personnel required training in both torture techniques and interrogation psychology. Information-sharing networks had to be established across vast distances. This was industrial-scale persecution, managed with corporate efficiency. The Spanish Inquisition developed the world's first international intelligence network, maintaining detailed databases of suspected heretics and sharing information about persecution targets across national boundaries with greater efficiency than most modern corporations. They tracked family connections, social networks, economic relationships, and political affiliations with the thoroughness of modern surveillance states. Now, let me show you exactly how this knowledge was applied to create 8 torture techniques that combined Renaissance engineering with psychological warfare to devastating effect. Anna Göldi was the last person executed for witchcraft in Europe, burned alive in Switzerland in 1782. But before her execution, she endured weeks of torture in a device that represented the pinnacle of Renaissance engineering applied to human suffering, the witch's chair. Picture yourself strapped naked to an iron chair covered with hundreds of sharp spikes, positioned with anatomical precision to maximize pain while avoiding immediately fatal injuries. This was not crude medieval barbarism, but sophisticated Renaissance technology designed by engineers who understood human anatomy better than most modern doctors. The witch's chair represented the marriage of medical knowledge with torture innovation. The spikes were positioned based on detailed anatomical studies to target nerve clusters while avoiding major blood vessels. The angle of the back was calculated, using principles of geometry to create maximum stress on the spine. The height was designed using knowledge of human proportions to leave feet dangling, creating additional pressure on already stressed joints. Anna Göldi's interrogation followed standard protocols developed by scholars and documented in torture manuals that were distributed throughout Europe. Stage 1 involved strapping the victim to the chair while explaining the charges in detail, creating anticipatory terror. Stage 2 added gradual heating of the metal, using carefully controlled fires placed beneath the chair. Stage 3 included tightening of restraints to drive spikes deeper into flesh. Each stage was designed to offer escape through confession, while simultaneously making confession appear to be the only rational choice. Victims were repeatedly informed that their suffering was their own choice, that confession would end their pain immediately, and that continued denial proved demonic possession, requiring even more extreme measures. The psychological pressure was often more effective than physical pain. Interrogators understood that breaking human will require more than just inflicting agony. They needed to create circumstances where confession appeared to be not just relief from suffering, but logical necessity. The witch's chair achieved this by combining extreme physical pain with carefully scripted psychological manipulation. Father Friedrich Ferner, a Catholic priest and witch-hunting advocate in Bamberg, described the witch's chair in his theological writings as a divine instrument that revealed hidden truth through righteous suffering. His scholarly justification demonstrates how intellectual authorities provided religious legitimacy for torture techniques that violated every principle of Christian charity. The documentation requirements for witches' chair interrogations reveal the bureaucratic sophistication behind these procedures. Every session was recorded by trained scribes who noted the duration of torture, specific techniques used, confessions extracted, and names of accomplices identified. These records were maintained in detailed archives and shared with other persecution authorities across Europe. Prince Bishop Julius Ector of Würzburg used witches' chair interrogations to extract confessions that implicated members of the nobility, clergy, and merchant classes. Over his 30-year reign, he executed 900 people while confiscating property worth over 2 million ducats. This was not religious purification, but state terrorism disguised as legal procedure. The witches' chair spread throughout Catholic Europe as Inquisition authorities shared engineering specifications and interrogation techniques through networks of correspondence that connected torture centers from Spain to Poland. Technical drawings and instruction manuals were distributed to ensure standardization of torture methods across different jurisdictions. Archaeological evidence from German castles reveals sophisticated torture chambers designed specifically for witches' chair operations. These facilities included drainage systems for blood and bodily fluids, ventilation systems to prevent suffocation, and specialized equipment storage areas. These were not improvised dungeons, but purpose-built facilities designed for efficient human processing. Anna Goldie's case demonstrates how witches' chair torture continued to be used, even as Enlightenment philosophy was challenging traditional authority throughout Europe. Her execution occurred the same year that Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart premiered his opera The Abduction from the Seraglio, highlighting the contradiction between Renaissance cultural achievement and Renaissance cruelty. But the witch's chair was only the beginning of a systematic approach to human destruction that would make even hardened interrogation experts today physically sick. Matthew Hopkins made himself rich by perfecting murder, disguised as divine judgment. Between 1645 and 1647, this self-proclaimed witchfinder general executed over 300 people using swimming tests that guaranteed death while maintaining the fiction of supernatural investigation. The swimming test represented the ultimate perversion of justice through impossible logic. If accused witches floated, they were guilty of supernatural evil and would be executed. If they sank, they were innocent but would drown before rescue could arrive. Either outcome eliminated unwanted individuals while providing authorities with divine sanction for judicial murder. Hopkins operated during the English Civil War, when traditional authority structures were collapsing and communities were desperate for scapegoats to explain economic hardship and social upheaval. He understood that fear could be monetized through application of pseudo-religious procedures that appeared to provide supernatural confirmation of predetermined conclusions. Take the case of Elizabeth Clark, a one-legged widow from Manningtree who became Hopkins's first victim and proof of concept for his business model. Clark was accused of witchcraft by neighbors who claimed she kept familiars in the form of small animals. Hopkins conducted her swimming test in the town pond while hundreds of witnesses gathered to observe what they believed was divine judgment. The binding techniques used in swimming tests were specifically engineered to ensure drowning, while maintaining plausible deniability about intent to kill. The thumb-to-toe binding method made swimming impossible for even the strongest individuals, while the additional weight of waterlogged clothing guaranteed rapid sinking for those who were not supernaturally buoyant. Hopkins chose test locations strategically to create maximum psychological impact on witness populations. Town ponds, mill races, and river crossings were selected not just for their accessibility, but for their visibility to entire communities. These were public venues where maximum numbers of people could observe proceedings and carry traumatic memories that would influence behavior for decades. The economic structure of Hopkins's operation reveals how witch hunting became a profitable enterprise that incentivized continued persecution. He charged communities substantial fees for his services, collected additional payments for each witch identified, and received percentages of confiscated property from executed victims. His use of swimming tests generated enough income to support a staff of assistants and maintain operations across multiple counties. Hopkins' manual, The Discovery of Witches, published in 1647, provided technical specifications for conducting swimming tests that would confirm guilt while maintaining appearance of divine investigation. His documentation of procedures reveals careful planning behind tests that were designed to eliminate suspects regardless of their actual ability to float or sink. Reginald Scott, author of The Discovery of Witchcraft, published in 1584, had already provided detailed criticism of swimming tests based on rational analysis of their procedures. His work demonstrated that contemporary observers understood the cruelty behind tests that were presented as divine judgment, but such rational voices were overwhelmed by economic and psychological incentives for continued persecution. Hopkins' campaign generated enormous profits through multiple revenue streams that created economic incentives for expanded persecution. Property confiscation from executed witches funded further investigations. Communities paid substantial fees for witch-finding services. Individual accusations generated additional charges for testing and execution services. John Stern, Hopkins's partner and co-author of persecution manuals, documented swimming test procedures in his work, A Confirmation and Discovery of Witchcraft. His technical descriptions reveal planning behind tests that were designed to confirm guilt regardless of physical evidence, while maintaining appearance of supernatural investigation. Hopkins's methods were studied and copied by witch-hunting authorities throughout Protestant Europe and colonial America, spreading techniques for judicial murder disguised as divine judgment across the Atlantic world. His business model demonstrated how persecution could become economically self-sustaining through careful exploitation of community fears and legal frameworks. But even drowning was considered merciful compared to what happened when authorities wanted to create public spectacles that would terrorize entire populations into submission. On May 19, 1545, the city of Geneva burned 34 people alive in a single day during what became known as the Great Purification. These were not crude executions, but elaborate theatrical productions that combined religious pageantry with state terrorism to create public spectacles designed to traumatize witness populations into absolute compliance. The technical engineering behind these mass burnings reveals sophisticated understanding of combustion dynamics and crowd psychology applied to state terrorism. Execution grounds were designed by architects using principles of amphitheater construction to ensure maximum visibility for audiences that often exceeded 10,000 spectators. Jean Calvin himself supervised the development of burning procedures that were explicitly designed to maximize both victim suffering and psychological impact on witnesses. Pyre construction followed detailed specifications that used layered combustion techniques to create slow-burning fires that would torture victims for extended periods while creating spectacular visual effects. The pyres were engineered masterpieces of controlled combustion. Green wood was carefully layered with dry kindling to create fires that would burn slowly enough to keep victims conscious for up to an hour, while flames gradually consumed their bodies. Some pyres included hollow chambers designed to collapse at specific points, dropping victims into beds of coals where they would be slowly roasted alive. Contemporary accounts describe the preparation required for these mass executions. Architects designed permanent execution grounds with stone seating that could accommodate enormous crowds. Engineers calculated sight lines to ensure that every spectator would have clear views of victim suffering. Even acoustics were considered to ensure that screams would carry throughout the assembled population. The religious rituals surrounding these burnings transformed executions into theological demonstrations designed to reinforce church authority while terrorizing any potential opposition. Calvin delivered elaborate sermons justifying the executions while victims were prepared for burning, creating spiritual legitimacy for state murder that made resistance appear not just illegal but blasphemous. The economic aspects of these mass burnings reveal the financial infrastructure that sustained persecution. Execution costs were charged to victims' families, creating additional trauma while generating revenue for continued operations, confiscated property from executed witches, funded prosecution authorities, and created economic incentives for expanded persecution. The case of Michel Chaudron demonstrates how these burning spectacles functioned as both entertainment and terrorism. Chaudron, accused of causing a plague outbreak through witchcraft, was tortured for weeks before her execution to extract confessions that implicated dozens of other community members. Her burning became a public festival that drew spectators from across the region. Pierre de Lancret, a French magistrate who witnessed Geneva's burning spectacles, documented the nature of these executions in his treatise on witchcraft. He described how authorities carefully choreographed every aspect of the proceedings to maximize psychological impact on witness populations, while creating lasting trauma that would prevent future resistance. The international influence of Geneva's burning techniques spread throughout Protestant Europe as religious authorities shared methods for conducting mass executions that would demonstrate divine authority while terrorizing opposition. Technical specifications for pyre construction and crowd management were distributed through networks of correspondence between persecution authorities. Michel de Montaigne, the French philosopher, observed similar burning spectacles and documented the cruelty behind executions that were justified through religious authority. His essays provide contemporary criticism that reveals intellectual opposition to persecution campaigns, but such voices were consistently overwhelmed by institutional incentives for continued violence. Theodore Beza, Calvin's successor in Geneva, continued and expanded the burning programs, while developing theological justifications that made murder appear to be divine mandate. His scholarly writings demonstrate how intellectual authorities provided religious legitimacy for state terrorism that violated fundamental principles of Christian charity. But even the spectacular terror of public burning was considered insufficient for maintaining social control. Authorities needed more subtle methods that could destroy individual identity while creating ongoing reminders of state power. Agnes Sampson, a respected midwife and healer from Haddington, Scotland, made the fatal mistake of treating patients using traditional herbal remedies during the North Berwick witch trials of 1590 to 1592. Her punishment revealed how authorities used iron masks to destroy not just individual voices, but entire networks of female knowledge and authority. The scold's bridle that silenced Agnes Sampson was a precision instrument of social control designed to destroy both physical ability to speak and social identity within community structures. The iron framework enclosed her entire head, while a spiked plate pressed against her tongue, making any attempt at speech result in severe injury to mouth tissues. This device represented the intersection of metallurgical craftsmanship with psychological warfare against female authority. The positioning of spikes was calculated to cause maximum pain while preventing communication, effectively transforming articulate women into silent spectacles for public entertainment and intimidation. Agnes Sampson's case demonstrates how scolds' bridles functioned as weapons against networks of traditional knowledge that competed with church authority. As a midwife, Sampson possessed medical knowledge that threatened clerical control over life and death decisions. Her public humiliation served to discredit not just her individual practice, but the entire tradition of female healing. The public parade aspect of scold's bridal punishment was carefully choreographed to maximize humiliation while creating lasting psychological impressions in witness populations. Sampson was led through Edinburgh's market squares, church grounds, and residential areas during peak business hours, when maximum numbers of people would observe her degradation. James VI of Scotland personally supervised the development of scold's bridal procedures that were documented in his treatise Daemonology. His scholarly analysis of torture techniques provided intellectual legitimacy for devices that destroyed female authority while reinforcing patriarchal control over community knowledge systems. The regional variations in scold's bridal design reveal technical innovation applied to gender-specific torture. English versions included bells that would ring when victims moved, creating additional public humiliation while advertising the presence of disciplined women. Scottish models featured complex locking mechanisms that prevented removal without specific keys held by male authorities. Contemporary records describe scolds bridal ceremonies that lasted entire days, during which victims could not eat, drink, or communicate while being displayed as public entertainment. Some women died from dehydration or infection caused by metal spikes penetrating delicate mouth tissues, but their deaths served the same purpose as their suffering, terrorizing other women into silence. The legal framework surrounding scolds bridal punishment provided detailed justifications for humiliation disguised as criminal justice. Women who challenged male authority in any context could be subjected to these tortures under broadly defined charges that made resistance to patriarchal control effectively illegal. George Mackenzie, the Lord Advocate of Scotland, oversaw numerous scolds bridal punishments during his prosecution of alleged witches. His systematic use of public humiliation was explicitly designed to terrorize women while reinforcing male authority over female speech, behavior, and access to traditional knowledge systems. The manufacturing of scolds bridles became a specialized craft industry that produced custom devices for different types of punishment and social control. Blacksmiths developed expertise in creating torture equipment, with the same precision and attention to detail used for agricultural tools and household implements. The integration of scolds bridal punishment with church discipline reveals coordination between religious and secular authorities in using torture for social control. Ministers would identify women for punishment, while justices provided legal authority for torture procedures that enforced patriarchal hierarchy through state violence. Agnes Sampson's treatment set precedents for scolds bridal use that spread throughout Britain and colonial America. Her case demonstrates how individual punishment served broader campaigns to eliminate traditional knowledge systems that competed with emerging centralized authority structures. But even the silencing of individual women was considered insufficient for maintaining social control. Authorities needed methods that could destroy human bodies gradually, while extracting information that could expand persecution to entire social networks. Guy de Chauliac, the 14th century surgeon whose medical innovations saved countless lives, would have been horrified to see his anatomical discoveries twisted into instruments of human destruction. The rack represented the perversion of medical knowledge as Renaissance torture specialists applied surgical understanding of human anatomy to create devices that could dislocate joints with mathematical precision. The mechanical principles behind rack operation reveal how medical knowledge became weaponized for information extraction and social control. The graduated application of tension was calculated using detailed understanding of human joint structure and pain tolerance, allowing operators to dislocate bones in specific sequences designed to maximize suffering while preventing immediate death. In the dungeons of the Spanish Inquisition, where over 150,000 people would be investigated and 32,000 executed during the institution's 3-century existence, university-trained physicians supervised rack operations, while mechanics operated pulleys designed to separate limbs from their sockets with surgical precision. The protocols for rack torture were documented in detailed manuals that specified pressure application rates, duration limits, and medical monitoring procedures. These were not crude torture sessions, but scientifically managed procedures designed to extract maximum information while maintaining victim survival through careful application of medical knowledge originally intended for healing. The Malleus Maleficarum provided specific technical instructions for rack torture that combined physical destruction with psychological pressure, designed to break human resistance through manipulation of hope and despair. The manual treated torture as applied medicine requiring careful technique to achieve desired results without causing premature death. The medical supervision of rack torture reveals unprecedented coordination between church authorities and trained physicians who ensured victims remained conscious throughout procedures, while preventing fatal injuries that would end. Confession, extraction. This represented application of healing knowledge to torture enhancement that violated every principle of medical ethics. Take the case of Galileo Galilei, who faced the threat of rack torture during his Inquisition trial in 1633. Although ultimately spared the physical ordeal, Galileo was forced to observe rack operations and listen to detailed descriptions of the procedures he would endure if he refused to recant his scientific conclusions about heliocentrism. The psychological impact of witnessing rack torture was deliberately calculated to break resistance without requiring actual physical destruction. Galileo's capitulation demonstrates how the mere threat of anatomical destruction could force even the most brilliant minds to abandon scientific truth in favor of institutional authority. Contemporary records describe rack torture sessions that lasted multiple days with carefully managed periods of recovery that allowed victims to heal enough to survive additional sessions while maintaining psychological pressure to confess. The nature of this torture created prolonged suffering designed to break human will through precise manipulation of physical and mental endurance. Tomás de Torquemada, the first Grand Inquisitor of Spain, systematized rack torture procedures that were used throughout the Spanish Empire, including colonial territories in America, where indigenous populations were subjected to these techniques during forced religious conversions. The technical innovations in rack design included mechanical advantages that allowed operators to apply extreme force with minimal physical effort, creating torture devices that could destroy human bodies through precise engineering rather than brute strength application. The psychological preparation for rack torture included extended imprisonment and preliminary interrogation designed to weaken mental resistance before physical torture began. Victims were shown torture devices while listening to detailed descriptions of the procedures they would undergo. The regional variations in rack design reveal technical innovation applied to torture improvement across different jurisdictions. Italian models included heated elements that added burning sensations to joint dislocation. German versions incorporated weights that increased tension beyond normal human tolerance levels. The rack's legacy influenced torture techniques used by authoritarian regimes well into the 20th century, as documented medical knowledge of human anatomy continued to be applied to human destruction by governments seeking to maintain control through terror. But even the destruction of human joints was considered insufficient by authorities who developed suspension techniques that used gravitational force itself as an instrument of torture. Galileo Galilei, the man who revolutionized our understanding of motion and gravity, came terrifyingly close to experiencing gravitational force used as an instrument of joint destruction. During his Inquisition trial in 1633, church authorities threatened him with the strappado, a torture technique that used human body weight against victims' own anatomy to create maximum pain while maintaining the fiction of divine judgment. The strappado represented the application of Renaissance physics to human destruction. The positioning of ropes and pulleys was calculated using principles of mechanical engineering to create maximum stress on specific joint structures, while preventing immediate death that would end interrogation sessions. Picture the terror Galileo must have felt as Inquisition authorities described in precise detail how the strappado would dislocate his shoulders using the same gravitational principles he had spent his life studying. The irony was not lost on him. The force that held planets in their orbits would be used to tear his body apart joint by joint. The escalation protocols for strappado torture allowed operators to increase pain while maintaining victim consciousness through carefully controlled application of additional weights and jerking motions that would cause joint separation without immediate death. The medical knowledge required for effective strappado torture included detailed understanding of human pain tolerance, joint structure, and cardiovascular limits. Cardinal Robert Bellarmine, who supervised Galileo's trial, had overseen hundreds of strappado torture sessions during his career as a church prosecutor. His scholarly writings on torture techniques provided theological justification for procedures that violated every principle of Christian charity while claiming divine sanction for human destruction. The psychological aspects of strappado torture included forcing victims to observe their own physical destruction while being questioned about beliefs and activities that challenged church authority. The combination of pain and helplessness created psychological pressure that often produced confessions to imaginary crimes. Juan de Torquemada, nephew of the Grand Inquisitor, developed enhanced strappado techniques that included heated weights and mechanical jerking devices that increased joint damage while creating additional psychological terror through unpredictable pain application that kept victims in constant anticipation of increasing agony. The duration of strappado torture was carefully calculated to achieve confession extraction while preventing immediate death that would end interrogation sessions. Victims could be suspended for hours with brief periods of lowering that provided temporary relief while maintaining psychological pressure to confess to whatever crimes their interrogators suggested. Contemporary accounts describe strappado victims developing permanent shoulder damage, nerve destruction, and psychological trauma that persisted for the remainder of their lives. The nature of this torture created deliberate disabilities that served as permanent advertisements of what happened to those who challenged institutional authority. The integration of strappado torture with religious ceremonies transformed physical destruction into spiritual purification rituals designed to drive out heretical thinking while reinforcing church authority over intellectual and scientific investigation. The technical innovations in strappado equipment included pulley systems that amplified gravitational force and mechanical devices that could apply sudden jerking motions designed to separate joints while creating maximum psychological impact through unpredictability that prevented victims from preparing mentally for each wave of pain. The international distribution of strappado techniques reveals sharing of torture innovation across national and religious boundaries. Technical specifications and training manuals were distributed throughout Catholic Europe and colonial territories, creating standardized approaches to human destruction that influenced persecution methods for centuries. Galileo's forced recantation under threat of strappado demonstrates how torture could force even the most brilliant minds to abandon scientific truth in favor of institutional compliance. His case reveals how physical terror was used to maintain intellectual control over entire populations. The strappado's influence on scientific development cannot be overstated. The torture of intellectuals who challenged church authority created climates of fear that delayed scientific progress for generations, as researchers learned to self-censor rather than risk physical destruction. But even the destruction of human joints through gravitational force was considered merciful compared to legal procedures that could trap victims in impossible choices where any decision led to crushing death. Giles Corey, an 80-year-old farmer from Salem, Massachusetts, faced the most psychologically twisted form of judicial murder ever devised when he refused to enter a plea of guilty or innocent to charges of witchcraft in 1692. His death by pressing represents the ultimate legal trap, a procedure that maintained the fiction of victim choice while guaranteeing destruction regardless of decision. Corey understood the impossible mathematics of his situation with crystalline clarity. Pleading guilty meant immediate execution and total property forfeiture to the state. Pleading innocent meant a rigged trial with predetermined guilty verdict followed by execution and property confiscation. Refusing to plead meant gradual crushing death, but preserved his estate for his family. The mechanical principles behind pressing procedures reveal engineering knowledge applied to human destruction through precise weight distribution and gradual force application designed to maximize suffering while maintaining victim consciousness throughout the crushing process that could last for days. Corey's pressing began on September 19, 1692, with authorities placing a wooden board across his chest and adding heavy stones one by one. The weight application protocols followed procedures designed to gradually increase pressure, while repeatedly offering opportunities for plea entry that would end suffering but guarantee execution. Each stone added to Corey's chest created additional pressure on internal organs, while officials repeatedly asked if he was ready to enter a plea. His famous response, "More weight," became legendary as he chose continued crushing over legal compliance that would have resulted in his death anyway while destroying his family's economic future. Contemporary accounts describe Corey's pressing lasting 2 full days, during which his tongue was squeezed from his mouth and his eyes bulged from increasing cranial pressure. Officials increased the weight, while repeatedly offering to end his suffering if he would simply enter a plea that would allow legal proceedings to continue. The psychological torture of pressing extended far beyond physical crushing to include the impossible choice between certain death through execution and probable death through trial. This created mental anguish that was often more effective than physical pain for extracting confessions from people trapped in legal frameworks designed to ensure their destruction. Sheriff George Corwin, who supervised Corey's pressing, had developed procedures for weight application that balanced immediate death against prolonged agony to maximize psychological pressure on victims while maintaining the appearance of legitimate legal procedure. The community impact of Corey's pressing created lasting trauma that influenced Salem residents for generations. Witnesses understood that challenging legal authority could result in physical destruction disguised as legitimate court procedure designed to ensure proper legal compliance. The pressing apparatus used for Corey's execution was specially constructed using engineering principles that ensured bone crushing while maintaining victim survival long enough to extract pleas or provide public demonstrations of legal authority over life and death. Martha Corey, Giles's wife, had been executed for witchcraft just days before his pressing began. Authorities calculated that this additional psychological pressure would break his resistance and force him to enter a plea that would allow property confiscation and legal closure of his case. Reverend Nicholas Noyes, who witnessed Corey's pressing, later wrote detailed accounts of the procedure that reveal how authorities used religious justification to legitimize torture while maintaining appearance of divine judgment rather than human cruelty. The economic motivations behind Corey's pressing reveal how property confiscation created financial incentives for continued persecution. His substantial farm holdings made him a valuable target for authorities who combined legal procedure with economic exploitation to fund continued persecution campaigns. Modern legal analysis of pressing procedures reveals violation of fundamental legal principles disguised as legitimate court procedure designed to maintain appearance of justice while achieving predetermined outcomes through torture that guaranteed victim destruction regardless of choices made. The legacy of Giles Corey's pressing influenced American legal development for centuries, as his case became symbolic of resistance to judicial tyranny and the dangers of legal systems that prioritize institutional power over individual rights and human dignity. But even the crushing of human bodies was considered insufficient by some authorities who developed thermal torture techniques that combined controlled burning with religious ceremony to create the ultimate fusion of physical and spiritual terror. Peter Binsfeld, Bishop of Trier, transformed thermal torture into religious ceremony during his persecution campaigns that resulted in over 1,000 executions between 1581 and 1593. His fire ordeals represented the ultimate fusion of Renaissance physics with divine authority, creating procedures that used controlled burning to extract confessions while maintaining the fiction of supernatural investigation. The thermal principles behind Binsfeld's fire ordeals reveal sophisticated understanding of human pain tolerance and tissue damage applied to torture procedures that could create maximum suffering while maintaining victim survival, long enough to extract confessions or provide public demonstrations of religious authority over life and death. Binsfeld's most notorious victim was Dietrich Flade, a secular judge who had criticized witch-hunting procedures as legally invalid and morally unjustifiable. Flade's ordeal by fire became a public spectacle designed to demonstrate what happened to officials who challenged institutional authority, even when they possessed legal training and social standing. The graduated heating protocols for fire ordeals allowed escalation of thermal torture while maintaining victim consciousness through carefully controlled temperature application designed to maximize pain without causing immediate death that would end interrogation or public demonstration. Flade was forced to place his hand on progressively heated metal objects while being questioned about his resistance to witch-hunting procedures. The thermal progression began with warm metal that caused discomfort, escalated to heated metal that created burns, and culminated with red-hot iron that destroyed tissue while keeping the victim conscious and capable of confession. The psychological aspects of fire ordeals included forcing victims to choose between immediate thermal torture and confession to supernatural crimes they had never committed. The combination of pain and religious pressure created psychological circumstances that often produced desired confessions to imaginary activities. The nature of fire ordeal procedures is revealed in detailed religious manuals that Binsfeld authored, providing step-by-step guidance for conducting thermal torture while maintaining appearance of divine judgment rather than persecution designed to eliminate intellectual opposition. The theological justifications for fire ordeals provided elaborate religious arguments that made thermal torture appear to be legitimate investigation of supernatural crimes, requiring divine intervention to overcome demonic resistance to truth, revelation, that could only be overcome through purification by flame. The technical innovations in fire ordeal equipment included controlled heating devices and thermal application tools that allowed precise temperature control while creating maximum psychological impact through visible preparation, gradual application of thermal torture that built anticipation of increasing pain. Contemporary accounts describe fire ordeal victims developing severe burns and permanent tissue damage, while being forced to demonstrate their innocence through thermal torture that was explicitly designed to confirm guilt regardless of physical evidence or victim responses to questioning. The integration of fire ordeals with religious ceremonies transformed thermal torture into spiritual purification rituals designed to drive out heretical thinking while reinforcing church authority over community intellectual life and resistance to institutional power. Binsfeld's persecution campaigns targeted intellectuals, legal officials, and clergy members who had expressed doubts about witch-hunting procedures. His use of fire ordeals was explicitly designed to terrorize educated populations who might challenge institutional authority through rational analysis of persecution methods. The community impact of Binsfeld's fire ordeal demonstrations created lasting trauma that influenced religious compliance for generations, while establishing cultural associations between intellectual resistance to authority, supernatural evil requiring elimination through thermal purification. Modern medical analysis of fire ordeal procedures reveals application of thermal torture designed to create maximum pain while maintaining victim consciousness through precise temperature control that represented sophisticated application of thermal physics to human destruction. The international influence of Binsfeld's fire ordeal techniques spread throughout Catholic Europe as religious authorities shared methods for conducting thermal torture that would demonstrate divine authority while terrorizing intellectual opposition to institutional power and persecution. These 8 torture methods reveal the most disturbing paradox of human civilization. The same intellectual revolution that gave us Renaissance art, scientific discovery, and philosophical advancement also produced the most sophisticated methods of human destruction in history. While Michelangelo carved David and painted the Sistine Chapel, inquisitors were perfecting devices that could destroy human bodies with surgical precision. While Galileo revolutionized astronomy and Newton unlocked the laws of physics, legal scholars were applying scientific methods to psychological warfare and social control. The witch-hunting period demonstrates how education and refinement do not automatically produce moral progress. The most brutal persecution campaigns were designed and implemented by university-trained lawyers, ordained priests, and government officials who applied their learning to create institutional frameworks for human destruction. The economic dimensions of witch persecution reveal how cruelty became profitable enterprise that created self-perpetuating cycles of violence. Property confiscation from accused witches funded prosecution authorities while generating personal wealth for officials who operated torture systems. This created economic incentives for continued persecution that sustained terror campaigns across multiple generations. The psychological impact of witch persecution extended far beyond immediate victims to create cultures of fear that influenced European and American societies for centuries. Children grew up understanding that challenging established authority could result in torture and execution disguised as legitimate legal procedure. The international coordination of torture techniques demonstrates sharing of persecution methods across national boundaries that created standardized approaches to population control through terror. These techniques were so effective that authoritarian regimes continued to study and adapt them well into the 20th century. The legal precedents established during witch persecution created frameworks for torture that influenced criminal justice systems for centuries, while providing intellectual justification for extreme violence against designated enemies of established authority. Understanding these torture techniques provides crucial insight into how educated authorities can use cruelty to maintain power, while convincing themselves and their societies that extreme violence serves legitimate purposes, requiring continued application against designated threats to social order. The witch-hunting period serves as a permanent warning about the dangers of unchecked authority combined with intellectual sophistication. It demonstrates that the capacity for cruelty exists within all human societies, including those claiming the highest moral, religious, and intellectual authority. If this exploration of witch persecution torture has revealed the nature of historical terror campaigns designed to maintain social control through fear, make sure to subscribe for more content that uncovers the brutal realities behind sanitized historical narratives. Comment below letting me know which of these 8 torture methods you found most disturbing and what other historical terror campaigns you would like explored, because understanding how persecution operates remains essential for recognizing and preventing similar patterns in contemporary societies. These historical examples demonstrate that constant vigilance remains necessary to prevent the resurrection of persecution machinery disguised as legitimate social protection, because the intellectual tools for creating terror are always available to authorities willing to abandon human dignity in pursuit of absolute control.